Hello, Philip. We're talking about glossolalia today, which in the religious Christian world may be the word of the century. Don't you agree?
Yeah, absolutely.
Hundreds of millions of people are influenced by this word, and some people don't even know how big the influence of this word, even though they practice it daily. So we're going to discuss the origins of this word and how it affects us today and all throughout history. Are you ready to roll, Philip?
Yeah, we'll give it a shot.
Philip is my friend. He's got his PhD from Duquesne University, and you were born in China, not Japan. Born in China to missionary parents and grew up in Japan, correct?
Made in China.
Made in China. And your doctorate dwelled into German works, and so this is in your sphere of doing this glossolalia study today.
Right.
Is glossolalia the traditional interpretation of the Christian rite of speaking in tongues?
Oh boy, that's a big question. First of all, I think we have to define what we mean by glossolalia. And if glossolalia means what contemporary scholars say it means, then I think it's something relatively new because it was coined in the 18th, early 19th centuries. And so I wouldn't say that goes back all the way to the church fathers.
Right. We haven't defined what I said, glossolalia. I said it's influential today, but I never defined it. The definition is a person going into an internal state of mind and words flowing out of their mouth like babbling or a frenzy or words that are unutterable. They're not human language. They're almost just unconnected syllables. Is that a good definition?
Yeah, I think so. I think there's some debate as to whether they're spontaneous or whether they can, be turned on or off at will. But I think that's basically what you would say it is. It's unintelligible vocalizations that are language-like but not language.
And the Pentecostal church, they don't use the word glossolalia per se, or the charismatic church who practice speaking in tongues in their churches. They would say it's a divine language between them and God. Most people would say that's still glossolalia. Would you say that's true?
Yeah, and I think most Pentecostal scholars and charismatic scholars today would equate the two.
As we discussed before, Reverend Heidi Baker, who's a well-known Pentecostal scholar, calls it Pentecostal glossolalia. So let's get back to the question. Is glossolalia the thing that happened in Acts and Pentecost and has continued on throughout the centuries and still continues today? Is that the correct interpretation of the historic church view?
Well, I think our second volume of our trilogy that we've just finished and published at the end of last year would make the case that it's not. That historically there are no antecedents in church ecclesiastical writings that would support the view that glossolalia is what is meant by the gift of tongues throughout church history.
Yes, I agree with that. Throughout my studies, I thought it was, when I started, that it was a constant throughout history. I wanted to prove the charismatic experience was true when I first started the studies, and I couldn't find any reference to glossolalia as a tradition throughout church history. And then I thought, well, how did this change happen? And so even though I'm not studied in German or later literature, I like to stay in the 4th century, 5th century with Latin, Greek, and Hebrew and anything else. I thought, how could I find the change? Where did it happen? Like you said previously, it happened in the 1800s where glossolalia became part of the Christian doctrine of tongues. I can't find it any earlier myself. I think we've answered the first question. No, it did not exist in the early church as glossolalia. They thought of it as the miraculous ability to speak or hear a foreign language.
Correct, yeah. That's what some recent writers who've addressed this issue would make a distinction between what they call the missionary expansionist understanding of tongues, which would fit that, and the romantic nationalist view, which is the view that would evolve into glossolalia eventually.
So we've established the fact that it's not part of the Christian tradition, the historic Christian tradition before the 1800s.
Right.
When did the glossolalia tradition first begin?
Well, the earliest document that recent scholars have found is a work by Christopher Gottfried Bardili. It sounds like an Italian name, but he was actually a German philosopher, a cousin of Friedrich Schelling. He was a contemporary of Kant, Immanuel Kant. He was critical of Kant's idealism, but he still accepted from Kant the notion of critical reason. And so he developed this theory of rational realism, and he interpreted 1 Corinthians 14, the expression glossolalein there, as a supernatural gift, but a gift of unintelligible and even unconscious ecstatic vocalizations. And he opposed this to the Greek heterais glossais, or the speaking of foreign languages, which he understood as being natural human languages. So he's the first to mention glossa as opposed to glossais. The singular glossa is referring to a supernatural gift of unintelligible, unconscious, and ecstatic vocalizations, which is very interesting.
From what you've related to me lately about the early origins, it seems like all the Gottfrieds get involved with this one. We've got Christian Gottfried Bardili, Johann Gottfried Herder, and Johann Gottfried Eichhorn, all in the mix here. Why is there all Gottfrieds involved in here?
Well, they're all Germans, and they come from the German, largely Protestant Lutheran tradition. One thing that I think is really significant about this discussion we're having is that a lot of the earliest trailblazers of this glossolalia theory were not even theologians. A lot of them were actually philosophers, and they were philosophers of the Enlightenment tradition. They were influenced by Immanuel Kant, David Hume, the rationalism of Kant in the post-Kantian period, idealism, romanticism, the rejection of miraculous events in Scripture, the higher critical movement influenced by Hume. What's interesting about this is that there's a kind of movement to interpret things naturalistically, which means anti-supernaturalistically. For example, in Kant, we have this distinction between phenomena and noumena. This is a difference between what is experienced through our senses in the phenomenal world and the noumenal world, which is unknowable but transcends the limits of human reason. So when it comes to a later philosopher like Krug, a few decades later, he would interpret tongues in two different senses. One sense is the ordinary language sense, which would be the immanent or phenomenal view. And then the other sense would be the transcendent sense, which would be the spiritual or non-human language sort of view. It's very interesting how these philosophers have influenced the whole interpretation of tongues in modern times.
It really fits into your field of studies anyways, the gift of tongues. The German philosophy, earlier German philosophy, infused in the definition of glossolalia. Not so much even theology, it was philosophy. That's very interesting.
Yeah.
We're only on the second question, really, and we've already done 10 minutes. This is going to be quite the journey. Let's go on to Herder, Johann Gottfried Herder. You have some information about him as well.
Yeah, Herder was a student of Kant. He was a German romantic philosopher and theologian. He was a poet and literary critic. He wrote a book called On the Gift of Tongues on the First Christian Pentecost. And so the way he understood tongues, first of all, has to do with his theory of language. And his theory of language is that language is more than just semiotics or linguistics. Language has to do with a linguistic patriotism, a kind of romantic nationalism. And so when he interprets, for example, the book of Acts chapter 2 and Pentecost, he sees this as intelligible language, but it's language that is highly enthusiastic, ecstatic. It's Jewish nationalistic sort of enthusiasm. So this is how he would interpret Acts 2. In contrast to this, when he looks at Peter in Acts 2 and his speech that Peter gives, he says all that's necessary to understand this is that Peter spoke a language that was known to all, such as Greek. And so when he comes to Corinth, he says the Corinthian tongues are not as intelligible, but this has to do with the excessively emotional and parabolic and figurative language used in the tongues of Corinth. And he influenced Schultz and Neander and some later philosophers and theologians like those.
So it's Herder that's really, like, I know in my research and in the book even, we don't give much acknowledgement to Herder, but subsequent studies are showing that it's all tracing back to Herder. Is that fair to say?
I think so. I mean, there's some other intervening theologians like Johann Gottlieb Eichhorn who are important too, but Herder is decisive, certainly.
Herder died in 1803, I understand that's correctly, and Eichhorn was not much after that either. So we're talking about earlier German philosophers on the influence of glossolalia. Glossolalia still isn't spawning into the world yet as a thought and as a philosophy. It's just in a confined circle at this time.
The first figure to really lodge glossolalia in a dictionary was Wilhelm Traugott Krug. He was a professor of philosophy and successor of Kant in Königsberg, which later became under a different name under the Soviet system. Then he was a university professor at Leipzig, but he was a philosopher, and again, a Kantian. He wrote a general dictionary of philosophical sciences, and he was the first to publish the neologism Glossolalia in Germany, which became Glossolalia or Glossolalia in English later. And this was in his dictionary.
Sorry, what's the name of the dictionary?
Well, the English title is, I don't know if it's translated, but translating the German, it would be a general dictionary of philosophical sciences.
And do you know when it was roughly published?
Yeah, it was published in 1829.
So he had a great influence.
Yeah. One of the things we see with Krug is that there's kind of a retro projection of German words back into the Greek that led to the formation of the neologism glossolalia. And, it begins with some German words like die Zungen, which means the tongue, glossen, which is kind of a neologism created by the Germans based on the Greek word glossa, which means language. So there's kind of this move to take a German conjunction, Zungenreden, tongue speaking, and then change that back into the Greek, which would be glossolalein. Those are two different words, but then to join them into a neologism called glossolali in the German pronunciation and glossolalia later in English.
Are you saying that the Germans borrowed the word glossa into German in various aspects, and lalia has a German kind of transition concept as well? And lalia in German what does that bring to their mind when they used it at that time?
Lalein, of course, is Greek, and it means to prattle or to jabber or mumble. The Germans incorporated that into their own language, and it wasn't Lalein, but Lalen, and so it was spelled differently and pronounced differently, but it became a German word effectively. And so their morphology underwent a sort of transition, an evolution in which it gradually developed back towards glossolali, and then that, of course, later became glossolalia in English.
Is it a term that the Germans use? Is it a pejorative term or a term to mock people, or is it just a regular usage?
Well, Krug is kind of interesting on that. Let me find what he said. So the suffix for the German word would be lali, which is the gloss on die Reda, which means to speak. There's a bunch of things about the different genders of the terms and so on I'm not going to go through, but the German verb lalen, from lalen in Greek, means to prattle, babble, or mumble. There's a distinction that one of these guys made. I forget which theologian it was, but it's a distinction between glossolali and glossomani. Mani comes from the word that we would pronounce as mani, or like a maniac or a manic sort of behavior. That's understood in a kind of pejorative way, but glossolali is not. Glossolali, like the English word glossolalia, is understood just as being a form of speaking in tongues as understood in the redefinition of modern times.
We go from Krug, and then from Krug, where does the word start to spread out?
Krug was his work was in 1829, and from there we go to Bleek, who's also in the same year. Bleek, we include some of his work in our first volume. You had a lot to say about him, I believe.
Yeah, it's on my website too, and just for people to know, this is Volume 1, Speaking in Tongues, a critical historical examination. It's within this book.
Bleek's work in 1829 in English translation would be called On the Gift of Glossolalein in the First Christian Church. So glossolalein means speaking in tongues, according to Bleek. And so he said that there are three different possible meanings for the word tongues, or glossais lalein. And the first is that it's the physical tongue, the organ with which we speak. And the second meaning is simply language. But then the one that he really focused on is uncommon expressions. And so he takes the mysterious tongues of Corinth, for example, to consist of uncommon expressions or provincial expressions that are not understood by everyone. And so this is kind of an interesting twist that the evolution of glossolalia goes through. He also is the first to propose that Pentecost was a gift of hearing, which is kind of interesting. Now, I'd not seen that before, but that first crops up in his interpretation, which is kind of unusual. So Corinth is a place in which the tongues that Paul was dealing with in Corinth had to do with unusual expressions, with an elevated, ecstatic sort of expression of feeling.
I'm just going to read some quotes from Heinrich Meyer's commentary. He says Bleek and Bauer were the most influential on this definition. That's as far as I could go. You're going even further further than what Heinrich Meyer thought. But Heinrich Meyer said, and I'm just going to quote from him, Bleek believes that glossae is poetic, inspired mode of speech, whereas Bauer believes it to be as speaking in a strange, unusual phrases, which deviate from prevailing use of language, partly borrowed from foreign languages. I'm beginning to see, at least here, from Heinrich Meyer, he's saying that the word glossolalia, at least in the 1830s, is really starting to take shape as a word and have influence.
Yeah, and Meyer is very significant. The idea that tongues are something spoken in an elevated ecstatic state where one is not even completely aware underwent a development. A German theologian by the name of Hermann Olshausen in 1829 and 1830, he proposed that what happened when people spoke in tongues was equivalent to people sleepwalking. In other words, you're not really in your own mind. You're sort of in a dream state. You're not completely unconscious, but you're in a sort of distorted sense of consciousness. But it was Meyer, the Meyer you mentioned, who even goes farther and says that there's a complete loss of intellectual consciousness and activity in the speaking of tongues. So he's the most radical in that sense.
We've got now Bleek and Bauer. We've got Heinrich Meyer. We see now glossolalia is starting to take shape in the German world. I think now we're starting to move into the fact that it's going to start branching out into the English world. Not quite yet, but it's starting. I think it started with Augustus Neander. Is that the next step you wanted to bring it to, or is there one step I'm missing?
Actually, there are a lot of steps that we can skip over here, but the first mention of the word in English, the one that is mentioned by the Encyclopedia Britannica, you're right, is Friedrich William Farrar, the Archdeacon of Westminster and Dean of Canterbury. But there's actually an earlier reference, which is from John William Donaldson in 1857 in a work called Christian Orthodoxy Reconciled with the Conclusions of Modern Biblical Learning. What's interesting about some of these thinkers like Donaldson is that, to put it mildly, they're very liberal Christians. They look for non-supernatural explanations of everything, and he's one like this as well. But he has the earliest reference to glossolalia in English in his work. He praised a number of other thinkers, for example, Edouard Rousse, a French thinker, as having the most satisfactory explanation of tongues as, and I quote here, a higher kind of inspiration which overcomes reason and gives unintelligible exaltation to the language.
I've never heard of Edward Rousse before. This study could go on forever, I think.
I think it could.
Just tracing this all, how it developed and the connections, it's amazing to me. Back to August Neander, though. I want to get it back to Neander because it hasn't quite reached the English world. And I think Neander is kind of the point where probably Donaldson took it off from, I'm suspecting anyways.
There's one other thinker I would mention who comes a little later, 1 year later after Neander's work. His name is David Schultz. He was a professor of theology at Breslau in Germany. And in 1836, he wrote an essay called The Translation and Brief Explanation of the New Testament Sections Relating to Glossolalia. So glossolalia would be the English way of saying it. But what's interesting about his work is that he addressed Neander, he cites Herder, Bleek, and Olshausen, and so forth. And in about 200 pages, he eventually switches to using the word glossolali as one word instead of separating reden with glossen as two separate words. So this becomes the beginning of glossolalia. What's interesting as well is that this has been cited recently as this work of David Schultz, which became the most quoted and discussed book in German scholarship in the 19th century. He stressed the primacy of Paul over Luke Acts, and he stressed naturalistic explanations, and so he believed that tongues were actual foreign languages. He agrees with Bauer on the physical tongue being the primary reference, but he also compares the tongues of Corinth to Dionysian and Bacchanalian sort of orgies and things where people just go crazy. He says the Jewish language of worship was transgressed by enthusiasts in Corinth. So the language of worship, the liturgical language, was transgressed by enthusiasts. One commentator says that this was the final nail in the coffin of the view that tongues represent actual human languages.
Which author or person or influence or movement would you like to do now?
Well, we've sort of been going in chronological order order, and after Schultz would come more recent people, but I think we skipped over quite a few as well. There's a lot more to be said about some of the earlier Germans. We did mention Hermann Olshausen. We did mention, I think we mentioned Ferdinand Christian Bauer. But, as I was reflecting on this whole development of the higher critical interpretation of glossolalia, it occurred to me that as I asked myself, well, what brought this about? What brought about this effort to reinterpret tongues as this unintelligible, ecstatic way of understanding what happened in Corinth and so forth? And it occurred to me that there was no real unearthing of a historical discovery of any kind. Rather, what happened was that there was a shift in assumptions that scholars brought to Scripture. In other words, the historical critics, the higher critics as they were originally called, were influenced highly by people like David Hume and his skepticism about miracles, David Friedrich Strauss, Ernst Renan, and many others who were very skeptical and looked for alternative, non-supernatural explanations for things. When they confronted the biblical idea of tongues, they were looking for a non-miraculous understanding. And what prompted this, I think, was the Irvingite revivals, as you suggested. Edward Irving, of course, was the leader of revivals in Scotland and England, especially in London. These came to the attention of people in the world over across in Europe, where all the eyes were riveted on London because of what was going on there. You mentioned that there was kind of an apocalyptic sense that they were approaching the end of the world with the Napoleonic Wars and so forth. Furthermore, Edward Irving was drawing crowds in London at his church of upwards of 13,000 people, which meant that they started selling tickets just to deal with the seating and so forth. A lot of celebrities came, Charles Dickens, members of the royal family, Thomas Carlyle, many others, people that we would know and we've heard of, attended. The Irvingites themselves, they thought that they were speaking actual languages in a recovery of the original gift at Pentecost. However, as it turned out, they weren't, and the German higher critics were looking for an explanation of this linguistic or non-linguistic behavior, which was naturalistic, and so they looked to antecedents not in church history, but they looked rather to ancient pagan Greece, to the Delphic oracles and so forth, who spoke in a language that could not be easily understood by anybody and so forth.
So we're seeing, though, that they went there, the German scholars went to see what was happening in the Irvingite church. They were looking to see if it paralleled the Bible as a foreign language, and I think what they saw was it wasn't happening. It was something else. I almost feel like from reading that they were giving a sympathetic tone to the Irvingites and said, well, it's just ecstatic gibberish. They're very excited. They're good people, and this is how we're seeing it. I don't see any condemning in any of what they wrote about the Irvingites, but they're just saying this is ecstatic. It's not a miracle at all. And I think it really brought, in the German mind anyways, that whole concept out of slumber, and then it kind of crystallized it into a more theological and doctrinal form. That's really where it started to happen.
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, people were well-meaning at this time, even if they weren't fully on board with the miraculous Christianity. There's a whole spectrum of views that are represented, of course, because we're looking at very secular Enlightenment philosophers and theologians, as well as more kind of like Philip Schaff, for example, is much more evangelical in his views of Scripture and so forth than Dietrich Strauss or some of these other Enlightenment theologians. So there's a whole spectrum of views, I would say.
I want to shift you into a little bit of where I've done my studies, even though I'm more broader than you. You've got more into the specifics, but I want to shift it into my broad spectrum of Augustus Neander. The influence of August Neander was pretty large in expanding it outside of Germany. Is that a good assumption to make, or maybe that's too broad?
No, I think that's right. Neander, I don't think, was so much original as just a brilliant popularizer of views that he acquired from earlier thinkers like Herder and Bauer, F.C. Bauer and others. He played the most important role in spreading this view of tongues as glossolalic of any of the German higher critics. So I would agree with you on that.
He pretty much, in his book, I don't have the exact name, The Planting of the Church. It's a big, long one in German, and it gets even longer in English. He's like a systematic theologian of German theology and philosophy, compiling all the thought and making it into a cohesive form. That's kind of how I view him.
You know, Philip Schaff, who maybe we'll touch on later, basically wrote a huge history of Christianity as well, which I use myself. He basically says that it's a reworking of Neander's work on church history, which is very interesting. Neander's work is called The Planting and Training of the Christian Church by the Apostles. That's sort of the shortened title of it in English.
So August Neander, he thought the real definition of speaking in tongues was ecstatic, or the language of the spirit. It wasn't the miracle of foreign languages. That was an interpretation done later. And then the real interpretation was lost, and the German academics and scholars had recovered what the original intent was. That's kind of what I get from what he's writing.
He was also opposed to the idea that tongues had an evangelical, that is, evangelistic aim, because he says that the knowledge of Greek that people like Peter and Paul had would have been sufficient to evangelize. So the meaning of tongues has to be something beyond this notion that languages actually, that the tongues represent actual languages. So tongues evolved, in his view, into an ecstatic form. In fact, in reference to the tongues of 1 Corinthians 14, he says that there's actually a loss of consciousness here, which is interesting. He also mentions that Paul warns against self-deception here. At least that's his reading of Paul, which is kind of another sort of footnote.
His views, he's a very good writer. I got to say, when I read his stuff, it's very well thought out. He compiles a lot. I almost think he's the German version of Thomas Aquinas in some ways when I read him.
That's high praise.
Yeah, almost. I said almost. There's not too many people that compare the Thomas Aquinas.
Right.
So we've got Neander, and then Neander had an influence on, I think, Donaldson, which you referenced that he came in the early 1850s to use the word glossolalia in the English language. I haven't read his stuff, you have, but does he actually say that it comes from Neander, or does he draw from a different source?
I haven't discovered that yet. I don't know exactly what his specific sources were. This is just a new discovery for me, Donaldson.
There's a lot of work, and I'm sure even viewers of this who've studied in this area may even write to us and say, hey, I found this. And I think the story is far from being finished.
Oh, absolutely.
We're just touching the tip of the iceberg here. This is the start. I'm going to be marveled at what's going to come out of this in the end. So we're going now to Friedrich William Farrar. He wrote the book, The Life and Works of St. Paul. In his book, he really likes Neander, and he takes Neander's thoughts on glossolalia and he bridges it to the English world for the first time in a popular fashion. His book was very big in the English world when it was introduced.
Correct. So he's more important than Donaldson in that sense, because I don't think many people read Donaldson. For one thing, he wasn't really a theologian as much as a sort of philosopher on this issue. For another thing, his views were rather naturalistic, and I wouldn't say they were very evangelical in a Protestant sense.
And who is F.W. Farrar? I know that he was the pallbearer for Charles Darwin's funeral, and I've just got to find out here that he was the Dean of Canterbury, a high position in the Anglican world. And so he was a high-ranking figure in the Anglican Church, and he wrote this book on the life and works of St. Paul. And here he takes from Neander, and he starts to spread the idea the Christian tongues, the Christian rite of speaking in tongues, was ecstatic and an exalted type of language. It had nothing to do with foreign languages. That's where it really started to take hold in the English world. And that was 1879. That's the spot. I really want to stay at 1879. I have two questions. First, we've been discussing first the fact that the German word glossolalia started in the 1800s, and then in 1879 it started entering into the English-speaking world, the Christian world, and started to take dominance in that realm of thinking. Are we on a tangent? Are we just, you and I, just saying this is a conspiracy theory and we're right and the rest of the world has always been wrong? Or are other people also discovering this beyond us, and it's becoming more and more common that this is true?
Two books that I've recently discovered, I think you may have mentioned at least one of them to me, but I've been reading them. One is a book by Nicholas Harkness called Glossolalia and the Problem of Language, and he's basically interested in the gift of tongues in a glossolalic sense as experienced in Korea. He spent some time in Korea and he does a study of the Koreans, but he has an appendix in which he goes into the development of the theory of glossolalia among the German higher critics, and he goes through a lot of these thinkers that we've just been discussing. We've only been discussing some of them. There are a lot more. An even more important book, in my view, even more recent book by an Indonesian seminary professor at Portland. His name is Eka Putra Tapamahu. The book is titled Contesting Languages, Heteroglossia and the Politics of Language in the Early Church. It's really an interesting work. He basically takes the view that the distinction between prophecy and tongues in the book of 1 Corinthians is a distinction between the dominant language, in his view, could have been, Greek or Latin or even Hebrew as a liturgical language or something, and then the languages of immigrants into Corinth from many, many, many different places who spoke in what he believes they just simply called tongues. And so these tongues referred, in his view, to these minority languages. The Corinthian minorities were forbidden to speak unless there were interpreters who could interpret this into the dominant colonial language of the Romans, which would have been Latin, or Greek, which was kind of the common lingua franca of the time, and so forth. It's a very interesting book, and he goes into a great deal of history as to how this modern theory of glossolalia came about, and he rejects it. It's a fascinating discussion.
His independent thought of this, without referencing my website or anything else, correlates with what we've been saying. It's an independently one, and I feel good about seeing that. We're not on a tangent. We're in the right direction.
Yes, absolutely. I think that's true. I mean, we may have some differences with specifics. Their findings do support the view that we're taking here. It's very interesting. There are a lot of variants. For example, there are some of these German theologians that thought the problem was a problem of poor pronunciation, for example, among some of those in a Corinthian assembly. And there are others who suggest that it was a problem of muttering and not speaking clearly. So there are all kinds of really interesting sort of variants to this interpretation of 1 Corinthians. Definitely we're on the right track in a sense that this understanding of glossolalia as a vocalization of unintelligible phonemes and so forth is not what one finds in any antecedent in ecclesiastical writings all the way back to the time of Christ.
Well, that's a good point, because I want to move this now into Bauer Gindrich, the New Testament dictionary, Greek dictionary for translating, most translators use. And Bauer Gindrich don't reference ecclesiastical writings hardly at all when you're supposed to translate tongues. They use the glossolalia definition almost exclusively. I think it's almost a crime that they've done that there, because translators for years, we always go with the New Testament Greek dictionary by Bauer Gindrich, and we go, oh, it says glossolalia. Oh, therefore it's glossolalia. But they failed to say, put in Gregory Nazianzus or Augustine or all sorts of different other authors who wrote about tongues. All they put down is like the classical Greek writers going to Montanism. And it's not just Bauer Gindrich. There's all other dictionaries and Greek dictionaries pretty much after 1879 went in the same direction. It makes it sound like glossolalia is the only interpretation. There is no alternative, which I think is bad scholarship. That's just how I feel about it anyways.
You also have mentioned before in our conversations, I think his name is Boehm.
Johannes Boehm,
Johannes
yes.
Boehm, who contributes an entry into Kittel's Theological Dictionary, right?
Yes, Theological Dictionary of the New Testament.
That's
yes.
right. That's right. I believe he's the one who had sort of Nazi affiliations, isn't that correct?
Yes.
Which may be why he's not cited so much anymore, but his entries are still there, certainly in Kittel.
And he very much traces the speaking in tongues through classical Greek sources. And when I looked at all his references, the word glossa, which is in Greek and is critical to the New Testament reading, either not existed at all or it didn't really have a connection whatsoever. He didn't mention, I don't think, one church writer at all in his references. He didn't struggle with the tension between the church interpretation and his interpretation and why his would hold out.
That's interesting.
But it makes, though, the researcher who doesn't know church writings very well, which mostly are in Greek still, they've never been translated into English, or Latin, not translated into English, they think then the church never wrote about this and were silent for 2,000 years, which is not true. We've really been sidewinked, or I don't know what the word is, about this issue where the scholarship has been very biased in dealing with this subject.
So much so that one of my colleagues, who's a New Testament scholar, when he was first introduced to your Gift of Tongues project, his reaction was to call it idiosyncratic because it doesn't fit with the prevailing scholarship today. But the problem is that the prevailing scholarship today is idiosyncratic with respect to the historical works, going back to the apostles.
Personally, I wonder, after doing this study, if our perceptions of our faith and religion, are they altered in other areas by biases? That's how I feel. But that's a different subject. I don't want to go there. But our faith has been shaped by German theologians more than we care to admit.
Right.
And most people don't even know it, but it is there. And it's not necessarily a bad thing, but we are shaped by that movement.
Absolutely.
So I just want to say, though, the Greek dictionaries before 1879 did not have glossolalia. After 1879, the popular ones that we use today all have glossolalia. They don't give you an alternative actually to see that there's a different opinion or point of view. I think that's unfair, but that's the way it's working right now. We've almost answered this question, but I'm going to ask it again. Why did these German authors choose to go through, well, we haven't even discussed this yet, but Montanism and the Delphic oracles instead of using church literature to show that glossolalia is the true interpretation of Corinth and the Pentecost?
Yeah, well, I think the answer to that is pretty simple given our research in our first two volumes. I think it's because they couldn't find any support for their definition of tongues as glossolalia in the church fathers. It's simply not there. There's nothing of that sort anywhere there. And so they had to go outside that. And first of all, they went to the ancient pagan temple of Apollo in Delphi, where the prophetesses spoke in an elevated language that most people couldn't understand. And so they took this as being an ecstatic sort of antecedent to the tongues of Corinth in 1 Corinthians 14. And the other source they went to was to the Montanists. The Montanists' priestesses were known to have spoken in vocalizations that were unintelligible, and they were roundly condemned, of course, by the bishop of Caesarea, Eusebius, who was a church historian, of course, and he doesn't even mention the word glossa or language or tongues when referring to what the practice of the Montanists, because he says what they're doing has no relationship to anything in church practice or in church history.
The word glossa doesn't even exist in that text, but yet it's a proof text to say that church history of tongues is ecstatic utterances. It's not a very good example there. A Pentecostal scholar by the name of Reverend Heidi Baker, who's very well known in Pentecostal circles, says that Montanism, she connects Pentecostalism with ancient Montanism to say that they're the lineage of what true tongues should be, and the Montanists are the example in the past, and they are the example in the present. I think Heidi Baker doesn't know her history very well, because Montanism is a fringe group, and some of their theology and practices was quite strange. If she knew her theology better, she would have sided with the Donatists in North Africa, who said they were the true church and they spoke in tongues, which to them was the ability, supernatural ability to speak in foreign languages. But I wouldn't want any affiliation with the Montanists, who said that the new Papusa was the new Jerusalem, and that Montanus, he himself somehow was the Holy Spirit or the representation of the Holy Spirit. It was going in the wrong direction for sure. I'd like to add though, like you say that they want to go back and they just want to neglect the church literature because it doesn't fit in with their view that glossolalia is glossolalia, because the church has a different definition of what speaking in tongues is over history. From a non-Catholic point of view, I know you're Catholic, from a non-Catholic point of view of viewing this is the fact that these German Protestant scholars did not like Catholic literature, and they viewed it as myth and legend. And so therefore they believed that they could just skip 1500 years of history and go to the classical Greek sources as more authoritative. That's my view of it anyways.
That's like Bertrand Russell's History of Philosophy, which goes from the early Greeks and Plato and Aristotle up to the Stoics, and then it jumps up to Descartes, the first modern philosopher, as though nothing happened for 1,500 years between the two.
Yeah.
Oh,
yeah. I know you can't say it, but I can say it. I think anti-Catholicism has really crept into the whole glossolalia dialogue, and it's part of the development of this doctrine. It's not there directly, but I think it is there in the shadows.
Well, that's interesting. I hadn't really thought of it that way, except for the chapters in our first volume that deal with anti-Catholicism, for example. But the issue is probably embedded in the dictionaries and encyclopedias today, even if the people today are not so anti-Catholic. I don't know. It's an interesting question, though, because even if the views that are expressed in these dictionaries and handbooks and encyclopedias of the Bible have all sorts of erroneous assumptions, and we're beginning to realize that today, people that go to research various issues related to Scripture are still reliant upon these sources which carry these assumptions with them. And so that's a problem, right? It's going to be some time before people can wake up to the fact that a lot of these sources, which are considered authoritative today, are really understood to be problematic.
Yeah, well, we've got a few more questions to go. Let's move on to the Delphic prophetesses, where they say that the Delphic prophetesses fall down and go in a vision and go in ecstatic utterances. Once again, I don't think the word glossa even exists in the text that they're referencing, from my recollection anyways. I'm pretty sure it is. I want to go back to Michael Sellos, who's a 10th century Christian scholar, and he said that when they spoke, it was in hexamic poetic verse. They were actually speaking in words that were human. They weren't ecstatic utterances even. I don't think that German scholars had actually looked through this totally clearly to wrestle with all the dynamics that were going on. They just found something to fit their presupposition, is what I'm thinking.
Yeah, I think that's true. I mean, it was elevated hexameter verse, as I recall, and so it's not just gibberish. It's not just unintelligible vocalizations. It may be incomprehensible to somebody who's not familiar with the elevated hexameter verse that was spoken by these prophetesses, these oracles at Delphi. It wasn't irrational. When they were uttered, they may have been uttered in a heightened sort of emotional state, but still the language was not, it wasn't a non-human series of vocalizations.
Oh, we could go on with this one. It's on my website and it's in the book. We'll just let people to look at it there and make their own conclusions, which my audience anyways, our audience, everybody who comes, they're curious and they're thinkers. They don't take anything at face value. They look and they find out. So we'll let them find that out. Can glossolalia actually parallel the Christian tradition of miraculously speaking in tongues? Could it be that over history, generations of Christians over the last 2,000 years want to repeat Pentecost? They want to repeat what happened in Corinth, so much so that their imaginations could take over and they think that they're speaking in a miraculous foreign language or hearing a miraculous foreign language, and actually it is glossolalia. Could that actually be occurrence in a lot of the historic events?
I think that's exactly what happened both in London with the Irvingite revivalists, and also I think it happened with the Pentecostal, the birth of Pentecostalism, both in Topeka and also in Azusa Street in Los Angeles. I think these people thought that they were speaking in actual languages when they weren't. And in fact, so much so that people like Alfred and Lillian Garr, who were in Los Angeles, went as missionaries to China thinking that they could count on God giving them the miraculous gift of tongues as he gave the apostles in the book of Acts at Pentecost. And of course, we know the story of that. Volume 1 of our book, we talk about how they were disappointed and it didn't work out. So the perception is one thing and the reality is another, right?
You touched on the Pentecostals, and I think we're going to end it here on the Pentecostals, but there is a transition state where I do believe the Pentecostals took the concept of glossolalia and spiritualized it into a divine prayer language. If they didn't have Philip Schaff to go on and a few other commentators that they relied on, I don't think they could have made the case for a divine prayer language. But I think we're going to have to leave it here. We're going to have to touch on that subject another time. But are you in agreement that Pentecostalism was influenced by the German concept of glossolalia and made it into a spiritualized version?
Yeah, I think at first, it wasn't. It was an independent crisis of missionary tongues, and we'll go into that more next time. But then later, as the Pentecostals caught wind of the fact that there was this theory of glossolalia from the German higher critics and people like Philip Schaff or Philip Schaff, who had considerable clout, I think that this is something that they latched onto as sort of supporting their view that tongues refers to a gift of a spiritual language or some kind of angelic language or a private prayer language or something of that sort. Already in Irving, we see that Edward Irving in around 1830, at one point he's frustrated because it seems finally that people are not speaking actual languages. He concedes that perhaps it's a language that is spoken in the Spirit and needs to be interpreted in the Spirit. And I think that's an idea that kind of catches on later in the holiness movement as well.
And just to conclude, that's a teaser. We can't get into the Pentecostal transition, but there was an influence. That's all we're saying right here. The one last thought is, how strong is the influence of glossolalia on our thinking of tongues? Can we think alternatives, or is it still too strong to see that the church had a different view? Or can we actually impact the academic world and say there is an alternative? This is not the only interpretation.
Yeah, well, it's certainly the dominant interpretation today in all the encyclopedias, all the sources, all the textbook dictionaries, and so forth. I think there is beginning to appear a number of cracks in this colossus of steel and bronze, so to speak. Scholars are beginning to crop up who are being published by Oxford University Press, Harvard University Press, and so forth, and they are setting forth views that are alternates to this glossolalic theory. And so I think that, eventually I think the view will prevail that this glossolalic theory has been a sort of, not a hoax exactly, but kind of a dead end.
It was a popular idea that took hold, and it's losing its prominence.
It's running out of steam.
Okay, we're going to end that now, Philip. This has been great talking to you. I've learned a lot, even from research. I've done a lot of research, and I'm still learning a lot. And I don't think I'm going to finish learning a lot, because I don't think there's an end to this. But thank you for sharing what you found.
Thank you, Charles. I really appreciate it.
We'll talk to you later, Philip.
God bless.